Today on the podcast, a mantelpiece moment that sees some of the worst opening lines in literature, a novel that grows on you, and of course the weekly reveal to what magical book I have pulled down from my to-be-read shelf. All of that and more this week on A Novel Review. Hello and welcome to the Literature Podcast, A Novel Review. My name is Seamus, your host, and together we will discuss, dissect, and explore the wonderful world of literature. And the wonderful world of literature is a vast and dense jungle, so let's start making our way through, one book at a time. Hey guys, welcome back. Thank you for joining me. My name is Seamus. I am the host. This is a book podcast, and today I will be discussing Elif Shafak's The Island of Missing Trees, and it's a great book at that. But before we get into it, I first discuss my mantelpiece moment, something to highlight from the week past. And this past week, I saw this on my Instagram feed and had to sort of check it out for myself. It was a contest, and it's still a contest for the worst opening lines that people can create and write. It's called the Little Lytton Contest, and the idea is, to write the worst opening line. So I immediately went and checked it out. I think it's been running now for 23 years, and it is just disgustingly bad, but wonderfully brilliant, because I think there is kind of like a nuance to writing a bad opening line. So I pulled a few of them, of course, to share with you today. So without further ado, another murder. I hate these crimes, said Inspector Jack Slayton. He hated them even more than he hated other crimes. Brilliant. All around there was a sea of ice-cold milkshake, but not the sort one wanted to dive into. I'm not sure what kind of milkshake anyone wants to dive into, but alas, here we are. I felt blue, and my glum mood was reflected back at me by the same coloured sky. Yep, that is an image that just is terrible, terrible writing. So yeah, a bit of fun, something to do at your desk when you're trying to Skype off some work perhaps. Just check it out, read a few of the lines. They're absolutely, terribly, wonderfully brilliant. So the Little Lytton Contest, that's what I did this week. Housekeeping, as always, all the scripts from the episode are available on my website, just in case you want to take a look at them. There should be closed captions on the YouTube video. And yeah, if you could like, subscribe, 5-star review, I would really appreciate it. It helps other people find the show, which is nice to create a nice little community. So yeah, thanks so much, guys. The world is unfair, said Miriam. If a stone falls on an egg, it is bad for the egg. If an egg falls on a stone, it is still bad for the egg. Today I just wanted to start the episode with sort of one quote from the book. It's this old kind of adage that you can tell has just been handed down from generation to generation. It's one of those quotes that I guess your grandmother tells you when you're in the kitchen cooking food. It's a quote that kind of sets the tone for this episode and the story itself, because this is not a story about happy beginnings and endings, nor is it, though, a story about sad beginnings and endings. It is simply just a snapshot of humanity. Let's get into this book, and what a great book to discuss it is. Elif Shafak's novel, The Island of Missing Trees. I scouted this as a book to read, and it looked really promising, and so I went out and bought it. And then, once I had bought it, I looked at the blurb, and then I looked inside the dust cover, and it listed Elif Shafak's entire arsenal of written words, and she has written a lot. Like, a lot of books. And I'll be honest, that made me a bit nervous to read this. Nervous because I thought for a moment that maybe Elif was simply just pumping books out, which, without sounding snobby, but sometimes when writers have these pumping deadlines, the quality can lack. I don't think that is a controversial opinion, so I was a bit tentative, and wow, I was happily proved wrong. I said in another episode, I smashed this book. It was so good, so lovely to read, and a wonderful tale of love and loss, history and modernity, immigration, and remaining in a world you consider your own. I think we need an overview, because this is a brilliant book, and we need to get everyone on a good level to understand what the hell I am talking about. Now, just as a preface, this overview is going to be told in the easiest way possible. It will not be sequential to the story because itself there is sort of two different timelines in this story, two different narrative arcs concerning different timelines and people. And I mean, one storyline of this story is told from the perspective of a fig tree. So yeah, I'm just going to try to do an overview best I can. Kostas is a Greek boy who is in love with and dating Daphne, who is a Turkish girl. Set in 1974, there are great and growing tensions between these two cultures that result in a bloody civil war. Two star-crossed lovers, young and in love before expectation and responsibility has touched them, moulded them, shaped them to not recognize another as human beings. They grow, and in that growth, Kostas is sent to England to flee the civil war. Daphne remains behind, and now separated, they grow apart. Years later, Kostas returns, driven by his love for Daphne, but it has been a long time and a lot has changed. Such a simple story, weaved amongst the chaos of a divided Cyprus and the struggles of cultural differences. But what happens when love blooms in the cracks of cultural differences? What is the outcome? Often confusion, pain, guilt for feeling a natural emotion against the backdrop of a needless hatred. I don't say needless hatred in a kind of reductive way because this was a real issue, but I don't know, without sounding too cheesy, I am pro-human life and against war, so that's my thoughts. But yeah, the guilt that can accompany love for simply being in love. This is a love story where you know someone will get hurt. Structurally, Elif does make an interesting decision because she reveals, and you know almost immediately, how the love story ends. I would say tune out now if you didn't want to hear the spoiler, but that is kind of made redundant by this structural choice. And I didn't mind that either, the fact that we know that eventually Kostas and Daphne do end up together with a daughter in England, because one of the main points of this story is about the progression of time. Now, I could explain what I mean by that, but why bother hearing me explain when I can just get the words of a fig tree to explain for me? And the quote goes, "Arboreal time is cyclical, recurrent, perennial. The past and the future breathe within this moment, and the present does not necessarily flow in one direction. Instead, it draws circles within circles like the rings you find when you cut us down." This isn't a story about beginnings and ends, but rather journeys, and that might sound incredibly simple, maybe even a bit of a high school level analysis, but truly it is just about the story. It's not so much about the beginning nor the end, but rather the middle. Because of this style, avoiding the beginnings and ends, you feel the story on a much more human level. It's not washed with this kind of happy resolution that neatly all comes to a tight end, but rather the snapshot of the interaction of humanity's weave, like the roots of a tree burrowing further down, mixing with all that is below. That isn't to say there isn't happiness or success in this story, that there isn't an inherent kindness nor victory, because we do know that Kostas and Daphne end up together, which is what we're all kind of rooting for the entire story, even though we know it happens. Knowing that they end up together actually removes this victory from the speculative unknown that the reader sort of has to go through. And so we as the reader focus more on the personal nature of the story instead. And so we sort of more closely pay attention to how they drifted apart and how they now come back together. This book is incredibly well balanced. It offers attention to both sides of an issue, both culturally and those that flee conflict and those that stay, as well as that tragic war of love. What I loved was it really paid attention to the issues and the pain that can accompany these moments. The isolation and the displacement some can feel when they flee a conflict, but then also the resentment and disdain people can develop when they are left behind towards those that have actually left. I felt that it was exploring these themes without picking a side, because picking a side is almost reductive and pointless, and I thought that it was incredibly well balanced without shining a light too much on one side, but also not taking anything away from the other side. When they meet back up, Daphne and Kostas, years later, you don't get the sense that there was, or there is, this kind of hatred, but more this kind of indifference to each other and what each other has been through. The walls are still up, and you realize the indifference and standoffishness is more from fear of being hurt and not from a hatred. So on the other timeline, Kostas and Daphne have had a child called Ada, and her narrative actually occupies a large part of the story because she feels herself a bit lost. There are elements of generational trauma, and I think that this is a really interesting discussion point because I feel like there is a lot of feeling that immigrants should just be happy when they move to countries like England, America, Australia, Canada, one of these countries, which obviously they probably are, in the sense that they have fled a conflict, but this doesn't mean that they are magically healed. And this displacement from society can become generational when a child grows up in a place but doesn't feel completely accepted into the culture because the culture they live and exist in doesn't include this other cultural side of them that they have fled. I think the best part of the story is, firstly, it doesn't feel like it's shoving all this down your throat, and instead it is dealt with in a really sensitive and mature way. But also, there is no one side that you don't feel sorry for. Everyone in this book who suffers deserves and wins your compassion, and for that reason, I think it is simply brilliant. Now, I know we're all dying to know the fig tree. So there is one character in the book that appears along both timelines, that of young Kostas and Daphne in Cyprus, and then Kostas and his daughter Ada in London. And that is the fig tree, which wonderfully appears on the front of the book. It is a wild one. I had heard that this part of the story came from the point of view of a fig tree, and I was really curious to know how it would be done because famously trees don't move that often. So to have a tree as a point of view character would be difficult to get around because it would mean that you would always need to have a reason for the story to be surrounding that particular tree. Elif does this masterfully, with the tree being both in Cyprus for the early part of the relationship and then sneakily a cutting is transported and repotted in London and survives. But bringing into the story the character of a tree adds this extra element that adds the wow factor to this story. But besides this, it also adds a really personal element to the story because we as humans always assume that other humans will be the being in each other's lives and that we'll always be by each other's sides. I'm not saying we should forego all human relationships and take up relationships with inanimate objects or plants or trees or anything, but I guess a tree is a living thing that can, perchance, whether you visit it in a garden or a park or wherever, but a tree can see a side of you, can be there throughout your whole life, through every season, and you might not even realize it. You might climb it, swing from it, bask in the shade, eat the fruit it produces. You can have quite a fruitful relationship with trees and plants, as well by extension, I guess, but never really be aware of it. Also, I just want to sort of note, I hope someone listening is appreciating how many tree jokes I have managed to bury in this podcast because it's a lot, and I want that on record, please. But anyways, let's get on with it. I think the best part of the fig tree is that it has not only a personality, but also has a bit of wit and attitude about it, and this actually makes a lot of the fig narrative quite humorous without being silly. I'm going to read for you a quote that highlights the brilliant writing style and the balance of the text, but also the subtle humour and attitude of the fig tree, and it reads, Adam and Eve yielded to the allure of a fig, the fruit of temptation, desire, and passion. Not some crunchy apple. I don't mean to belittle a fellow plant, but what chance does a bland apple have next to a luscious fig that, still today, aeons after the original sin, tastes like lost paradise? The fig tree is like, you want to need an apple over me? You are a peasant. So, what would I rate this novel out of 5? I am going to give it a 4.6 out of 5. So, what am I reading this week? This week I am reading The Man Who Planted Trees by Giono. It is a beautiful little story about a man planting trees. Would you believe it? I bought it on a whim, wanting something short and refreshing to breeze through, and this did not disappoint. It's incredibly short, like 30 pages. I think I read it in about 30 minutes. It's incredibly short and beautiful and a little snapshot of a story. It's about a man who comes across another man living in Provence, which is a region in France, and all day, every day, he goes out and plants trees. The first man comes back every year to visit him, and it is just this incredibly beautiful. There's this wonderful sense of serenity and charm and hope to the story, and basically it inspires you, and it just kind of, it inspires you that you as an individual can make a difference to the world, and I thoroughly recommend it to anyone out there just wanting like a brief little snapshot of a wonderful little story. So, The Man Who Planted Trees. Now, before I close out the show, if you have listened this far, please consider hitting those 5 stars. I would really appreciate it. Also, feel free to head along to the website and support the pod, subscribes on YouTube. But as always, thank you for your attention. So I think it's time to end this episode. And today, to take us away, I think this passage from Oscar Wilde's The Selfish Giant. And it reads, "And the child smiled on the giant and said to him, 'You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise.' And when the children ran in that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, all covered with white blossoms."